Tonight's story is Tea and Treachery at the Village Inn. Welcome, dear listeners, I'm Charles Whitmore, your host in this quiet parish of Street Mary Mead. On an evening that seemed no different from any other, the Blue Boar's brass kettle steamed cheerfully on the hob, while laughter drifted from its oak-panelled room. Yet among the teacups and polite chatter, a letter lay oddly smudged with ink, and the smallest gesture at the tea table began to feel strangely out of place. If you delight in the gentle puzzles and quiet suspense of Miss Marple's world, do subscribe, so each new tale may find its way to you. Now, let us step through the inn's doorway together, where the story begins. Chapter 1. An ordinary afternoon. The roses were in bloom that summer afternoon, clustering in profusion against the neat white walls of Miss Marple's cottage. They were the sort of roses that seemed to lean forward as though wishing to listen to the conversation of those within. Pinks and soft creams, with a scatter of blowsy reds, all nodding in the light breeze. Inside, the cool, shaded sitting room smelled faintly of lavender polish and old books, and on the small round table near the window a neat tea tray had been laid. Dolly Bantry, never one to arrive anywhere without her own supply of news, had already ensconced herself in the chintz-covered chair, her hat tossed onto a side table, her gloves dangling from one hand. "My dear Jane," she began, not waiting to be offered the plate of fruitcake, "there is the most interesting new arrival at the Blue Boar. Quite the figure. A retired tea planter. From Ceylon or India. I cannot remember which, who has apparently taken a long let of their best room." Miss Marple, pouring out the tea with her usual precision, made no comment, but the little crease at the corner of her eyes suggested polite curiosity. She placed Dolly's cup before her. 2 lumps of sugar, exactly as she liked it, and gently urged the fruitcake nearer. Colonel Bantry, who had accompanied his wife more from habit than inclination, stood by the window, puffing at his pipe and regarding the roses outside with the air of a man who would much prefer the company of his dogs. He gave a snort. Another outsider cluttering up the place. Innkeepers will let their rooms to anyone these days, provided he pays his bill promptly. "Now, Arthur," said Dolly, unruffled, "don't be so tiresome. You know perfectly well that the Blue Boar hasn't had a decent guest in ages, and the poor landlady has to make her living somehow. Besides, I am told he has the most thrilling stories of jungles and elephants and whatnot. Everyone was quite enchanted last night." Miss Marple set her own cup down and folded her small, capable hands in her lap. "I dare say such stories would enliven the high street," she murmured. "People are always grateful for something a little out of the ordinary." "Stories, yes," said the Colonel, turning back with a grunt. "But what business has a fellow like that, retired or not, asking endless questions about the Clements marriage settlement, or how many acres belong to old Mrs. Hartnell's brother? Griselda tells me he was positively inquisitive at tea yesterday. Downright nosy, I call it." Dolly leaned forward, eyes bright. "Oh, did Griselda say so? I must say I thought it rather charming, his interest in all our little doings. After all, he is practically a stranger, and must find it diverting to hear of our old families and their connections." Miss Marple's gaze rested for a moment on the roses swaying gently beyond the glass. She had long observed that people who asked many questions were not always seeking information of the sort they pretended. Still, she merely smiled, and offered Dolly another slice of cake. "I suppose," Dolly continued, nibbling cheerfully, "that one must allow him his amusements. He has taken the large room overlooking the garden, and I fancy he intends to stay some time. They say he even brought a dispatch box with him, as though he were still running some great enterprise." The Colonel gave a snort that was almost a growl. "Dispatch boxes! We shall be having ministers of state dropping in next, I shouldn't wonder. He'll upset the rhythm of the place. Mark my words. Best thing for Street Mary Mead has always been its quiet. Too many strangers, and you'll have gossip flying thicker than ever." Dolly, however, looked delighted at the prospect. "Oh, Arthur, you always make mountains out of molehills. Think how dull we should be without the smallest ripple of excitement. Mrs. Price Ridley is already convinced she met him years ago in Bath, though I dare say she confuses half the people she meets with someone else. It gives her something to chatter about at the grocer's, at any rate." Miss Marple permitted herself a faint smile. "I expect it will be very pleasant for the village to have some new conversation. People thrive on novelty. It will be interesting to see what impression Mr. Grant makes once he has been with us a little longer." "Grant, is it?" muttered the Colonel. He relit his pipe, sending curls of blue smoke into the still air. "Well, Grant or no Grant, I should like to know why a fellow retired from the colonies would come poking about here instead of settling quietly by the sea, as most of them do. Too much curiosity is never healthy." The tea things were replenished. Dolly helped herself with gusto while Miss Marple stirred her cup with thoughtful exactness. The ticking of the small mantel clock punctuated the conversation, steady and unhurried, just as the rhythm of village life moved on, one gentle step at a time. Outside, the roses nodded again, as though acknowledging that just something had shifted ever so slightly in Street Mary Mead that afternoon. Chapter 2. Tea at the Blue Boar. The Blue Boar had a comfortable look about it, as if it had been put together by people who knew the exact value of simple things. A good hearth, a clean flagstone floor, and a certain honest clutter of useful objects that never pretended at luxury. The brass kettle on the hob gleamed warm and familiar. The mantel clock gave its placid tick. Mismatched cups and saucers stood in patient rows upon the dresser, each with its own faint crack or flirtation of gold on the rim. It was the kind of room in which village life unrolled itself like some slow, agreeable play, no more and no less. And Miss Marple, who had long since learnt to read people as others read a favourite comforter, found that she liked to sit there and learn a little of the village's present from the ordinary things about her. Dolly Bantry had not been wrong when she said the newcomer was such a character. Mr. Alistair Grant, who had installed himself in the long room at the back, was already well on the way to making an impression. He possessed the easy correctness of a man who had spent much of his life abroad in society where certain small forms of civility were as regular as the tides. His tale-telling was accomplished plantations, the weather of distant islands, the efficiency of overseers, and the peculiar charm of colonial architecture, things that, for a few minutes, allowed those present to imagine exhaustive distances. Mrs. Price Ridley was there, as she commonly was, installed near the window that looked down upon the High Street. She wore the airs of someone perpetually prepared for acquaintance with half of Bath, and never failed to sit in a posture which made it clear that she was, at all times, ready to be seen. Miss Hartnell sat knitting on the settle, her sensible hands working with quiet rhythm, and a couple of farmers, boots caked with yesterday's mud, leaned on the table exchanging comments about the market. Mrs. Piper, the landlady who kept the Blue Boar with the brisk economy an inn of its sort, must possess moved between the guests, a dish towel over her shoulder, setting down cups and refilling teapots with practised speed. "What a pleasant voice he has," Dolly said, as if admiring a particularly neat stitch. "And such a way with a story. He has lived in places one only reads of in books." Her tone was pleased, conspiratorial. The village liked novelty for a fortnight, and Dolly's pleasure was the village's pleasure made manifest. Mr. Grant's stories fell easy into the room. He described long, golden afternoons, the smell of drying tea leaves and the slow, careful work of picking. He spoke of managers with upright backs and of native workers whose faces he admired for their patience. Yet, though his sentences painted exotic scenes, they were punctuated at odd intervals by questions and remarks that seemed, at first, to belong to another conversation. "One notices," he said one time, lifting a cup with leisurely grace, "how a small place keeps a certain continuity, houses that pass from hand to hand, a lane whose hedges have seen 3 generations of the same family. These things fascinate me. It is curious to see who still holds the old land, who has married where, and how the little parcels of property have been shuffled." He uttered the words as if savouring the detail. Mrs. Price Ridley brightened. "Oh, indeed, Street Mary Mead is full of those stories. I believe I once met someone in Bath who knew the Hartwells," she declared, pronouncing the name with relish. Miss Hartnell's knitting paused. "People do cherish their histories," she said, gently, as if laying a stitch across memory. "The vicarage, for instance, keeps many of the parish records, and Reverend Clement—" Mr. Grant smiled and inclined his head. "I should very much like to be introduced to the Reverend, if he would have me. Old records, wills, names, who succeeded to what are perhaps the most unpretending form of romance one can find. A village has a book of itself written in such things. It was the particular sort of curiosity that, to many, inferred nothing but affection for local colour. To Miss Marple, who had long been accustomed to noticing what lesser people neglected, the curiosity whispered its own subtleties. She watched not merely what Mr. Grant said, but what he did. He folded his napkin with a slight precision. He set down his cup with a small and deliberate motion. When a sugar tongs was preferred, he took care to select 2 lumps, and, as he lifted his fingers, Miss Marple observed that the nails of his right hand bore soft, dark smudges, as though ink had been worked beneath and around them. It was nothing dramatic, merely a small stain, but such stains were like the faint threads on an old garment that suggested where and how it had been mended. "Ah," Mrs. Piper said, coming close to the hob to replenish the kettle. "He's a tidy gentleman. Brought a dispatch box in with him this morning. Said there were letters to be forwarded. I keep the key under the cloth by the register when he's out, and he's quite particular how his post is handled." The announcement of the dispatch box caused a brief rustle of interest. A dispatch box is, in the villages, as in the world at large, a useful thing for a man with papers, but together with Mr. Grant's questions about small family matters, the box gave Miss Marple's little mental ledger another line to note. Dispatch boxes suggested business, or affairs, or a kept correspondence. The combination was not in itself suspicious. Most business is without malice. Yet where precise papers and questions about inheritances met, Miss Marple found it sensible to watch and not to ask too loudly. "Dispatch boxes make people think of embassy things and very serious men," grunted a farmer, in a voice that held both mockery and appreciation. "I'd like to see a dispatch box. Bet it's a stout thing, musty at one end with old receipts and stale tobacco." Dolly laughed. "You are ridiculous, Samuel. Mr. Grant is not a government man at all. He is merely a retired planter who likes his papers in order. People are apt to be very tidy about what they keep, you know." Mr. Grant, for his part, seemed to enjoy the village's small-scale interest in him. He answered questions with an air of amused civility and turned the conversation deftly. "Order is a comfort," he said. "I much prefer to know where one's papers lie. It gives a person a sense of control." Miss Hartnell smiled kindly and asked whether Mr. Grant would be going to the vicarage for tea. Reverend Clement, she explained, had a small curiosity for parish records, and the vicarage was always ready to receive a newcomer whose manners were pleasant. Mr. Grant accepted this with a civil bow and spoke with a touch of real feeling of the importance of small courtesies in binding a community together. All the while, Miss Marple took in little domestic facts: the kettle's steady whisper, the clock's measured tick, Mrs. Piper's apron folded with the particular neatness of someone who had been a housekeeper in former days. She noted how Mr. Grant's shoes had an understated polish, how his waistcoat kept a small crease that suggested it had been repressed with some care, and how he had the faint scent of a tobacco he did not smoke, but which sometimes accompanies the presence of people who have lived in other climates. When a stray child came in, cheeks still damp from a sudden storm, and clambered upon a chair with the unconcern of the very young Mr. Grant bent and spoke in a kindly whisper, producing for the child a small foreign coin which he laid in the youngster's palm like a secret treasure. The child's eyes grew large and astonished. "Mrs. Price Ridley clucked and pronounced him most considerate. Again the village warmed to him. Miss Marple filed everything away with an economy of thought. She had discovered long ago that one did not need to rush to conclusions. A life is a slow book and, as it is read, certain lines return more clearly. An ink stain, a dispatch box, an interest in local pedigrees. These were not proofs, merely notes. In that way, the Blue Boar, with its steady kettle and clock, its safe windows on the high street, was exactly the place to meet the world's small perturbations and to let them be set in a proper order. Before she rose to go, Miss Hartnell, with her usual demure good sense, made some arrangement to call that week on a neighbour and promised with soft insistence that Mr. Grant should find his way to the vicarage. Dolly, who had been enjoying the spectacle with visible relish, declared that his being in the village would give them something to talk about for a month at least. Outside, the high street went on in its friendly shuffle. Greengrocers, a boy wheeling a basket, the clack of a cart's wheel. Miss Marple tucked her gloves neatly into her muff and smiled at the brightness of the day. She had noticed the small things. She had made her small notes. Nothing at the moment required more than an attentive patience, and that was an economy of feeling to which she was committed. Chapter 3. A Quarrel over Sherry. Gossington Hall had that restful air of a house which had been lived in and loved for many years. A few portraits on the wall, a pair of heavy curtains at the windows, and an everlasting scent of lemon polish that seemed to belong to the pantries as much as to the drawing-room. Dolly Bantry liked her rooms to be orderly and hospitable. The sideboard that afternoon bore the usual domestic pageant: Dolly's half-sliced fruitcake on a silver plate, a low dish of sugared almonds, the great cut-glass decanter of sherry that Colonel Bantry insisted on for the sake of appearances, and a small bowl of freshly cut roses from Miss Marple's cottage, which Dolly had by no means minded borrowing for the occasion. They were a small, comfortable party. Colonel Bantry, in a chair by the window, had his pipe in its customary place, and was engaged in the military pastime of observing people in a manner that disguised curiosity under a mantle of indifference. Griselda Clement, delicate and kindly, sat nearer the fire and kept one eye on the door, as if to make sure the vicarage's obligations to civility were being duly observed. Dr. Haydock had been invited on account of his knowledge of local affairs and because his frank presence was considered reassuring by most people. Mrs. Price Ridley, summoned by the prospect of new acquaintances and the chance to be seen, had taken a prim position opposite Dolly, her silk rustling as she arranged her fan. Miss Hartnell, with knitting in her lap, completed the circle. Mr. Alistair Grant had accepted Dolly's invitation with the air of a man who appreciated good company and good sherry in equal measure. He moved with a certain economy of gesture that suited the big, familiar room. His sun-browned face and quiet moustache seemed in place among the old furniture and the portraits of long-gone Bantrys on the walls. Dolly, being Dolly, was in high spirits. "You must tell us again about the picking season," she urged, cutting herself another neat slice of fruitcake and laying it on a tiny plate embroidered with the Bantry crest. "There is nothing so instructive as a story from the colonies, particularly when one's appetite is promenaded by such a good sherry." Mr. Grant obliged, and for a while the conversation slid into the comfortable groove of tale-telling. He described, with that precise economy of the man who has been abroad, the early light over a tea garden, the way the dew would gather on the leaves and the picking would begin in a certain hush. He spoke of overseers who kept notes and of accounts written with the care of men who knew that a small mistake could make great differences at the year's end. He had an amused air when he told of the Englishmen who went out to the colonies, expecting adventure, and found themselves surprisingly occupied with ledgers and receipts. Yet, amid the agreeable talk of far places, odd threads kept reappearing, small remarks that made the listeners raise their heads. "I have always been rather fond of small local histories," Mr. Grant observed at one point, tapping his glass with a delicate, almost formal gesture. "There is an honesty in registers and the little transfers of property that one finds most consoling. People think of these things as dull, but they tell one such intimate truths about a place." Griselda, who had been listening with the gentle concentration of someone who tended a parsonage and its cares as naturally as other people tended their gardens, nodded thoughtfully. "He was inquiring about some of the parish records when he visited the vicarage the other day," she said, in that soft voice that could carry information without seeming to do so. "He seemed particularly interested in the question of certain bequests, and in who had succeeded to various cottages and small parcels over the years." Mrs. Price Ridley, always eager to connect a face to a remembered name, gave a small approving sound. "He reminds me of someone I met in Bath once. One never quite forgets a certain type. Perhaps it was merely the hat. Oh, you know how these things lodge in one's mind. But there was a particular look, rather foreign and rather decisive, which made me think, at once, I have seen you somewhere before." Colonel Bantry, who had taken to wandering away from the drawing-room once he had said his piece, had strolled into the adjoining conservatory on the pretence of inspecting the orange trees. The conservatory's French windows stood ajar to let in a soft, cooling air, and the roses from Miss Marple's cottage, that Dolly had ordered placed there, filled his nostrils with the familiar scent. He was intent on his pipe and the quiet contemplation of weather when, quite by chance, he became aware of voices, 2 voices, low and urgent, that belonged to Dr. Haydock and Mr. Grant. The words reached him with a certain clarity, as though the panes allowed confidences to slip through. "You have no right to conceal the truth," the voice of Dr. Haydock said, crisp and grave. Colonel Bantry started, for the sentence carried a weight he had not expected to find in a drawing room. He drew a little nearer, keeping himself partly hidden by a pot of orange blossom. Voices in the main room went on the clink of a spoon against a teacup. Dolly's bright laugh. But the exchange in the conservatory had a tone that suggested not mere difference of opinion, but some private insistence. Mr. Grant's reply, lower and just borderline civil, reached the Colonel. "Doctor, I am grateful for your advice, but I have my reasons for seeing things as I do." "You are not the man to decide for other people what they should know," Dr. Haydock insisted. "There are matters of health and of conscience. I have seen what secrecy can do and what it has done already. If you believe yourself to be the arbiter of such secrets, you forget that they touch the lives of others." The Colonel, who by habit both prided himself on being discreet and had a soldier's distaste for overheard quarrels, felt himself tugged between the wish to remain invisible and a sudden piqued curiosity. It was not, he told himself, his business to pry. Yet the line Dr. Haydock had used, "You have no right to conceal the truth," struck like a pebble dropped in still water. It suggested that something more than parish records and the neat keeping of ledgers lay behind Mr. Grant's interest in the village. He retreated to the drawing room with an air of having been simply admiring the conservatory plants. No one noticed his minor agitation beyond Dolly's bright question of whether he would have another glass of sherry. He declined, murmuring that he had had enough, and gave a little cough of being in the country air, though his mind was in a small tumult of conjectures. Was the quarrel merely a difference about etiquette, who should see which document, or did it concern something more private? A medical injunction, perhaps, or a hush about a scandal that someone thought best not to be aired. Griselda, who had been quietly watching Mr. Grant with the grave curiosity of a woman accustomed to listening to people's confidences, said nothing of her own accord, but the fact that she had mentioned his questions at the vicarage did not look innocent now. People who knew the parish registers and who had handled the vicarage's old books often had in their heads a trail of small human tragedies and private fortunes. The vicarage was, after all, a repository of both keeping and mercy. Mrs. Price Ridley, untroubled, went on with her pastoral observations. "I do say, one always thinks of Bath in the morning when one sees a gentleman with an air like his. It is a pleasant association." She smoothed her fan and surveyed the company as if she had arranged them for a small fete. Dolly, who liked guests to be comfortable and conversation to remain amiable, tugged at a plate and offered it to Dr. Haydock. "You must not frighten our Mr. Grant away, Doctor. He is merely curious, and curiosity is the salt of life." Dr. Haydock accepted a slice of cake, but his face had not entirely relaxed. He was a kindly man, with the straightforward look of someone to whom people came with confidences, and he understood the perils of untended secrets. He poured himself another glass of sherry with the professional steadiness of a man who had seen too many small misfortunes traceable to hushed things. As the afternoon wore on, the talk resumed its gentler course. Mr. Grant was attentive and tactful, smiling and diverting any direct inquiries with small anecdotes of life abroad. Yet Colonel Bantry's hearing had lodged the phrase like a thorn. He found himself watching Mr. Grant's hands when the man paid a compliment to Dolly's cake, and noting again, in that dry, slow way that made him less susceptible to impression but not wholly immune, the deliberate neatness of his behaviour. When the guests departed, the little party cooled into the ordinary civility of Gossington Hall. Miss Hartnell left with a basket of knitted garments destined for an ailing neighbour. Mrs. Price Ridley, smoothing her skirts, promised to call at the grocer's on the way home and to mention the new gentleman from Bath, Dr. Haydock shook Dolly's hand with a professional gravity, and Colonel Bantry, pulling his coat tight about him, went out into the dusk with a small cloud of pipe smoke curling from his lips. Dolly, as was her way, dismissed the moment with a laugh. "Arthur, you look as though you've seen a ghost," she declared, handing him the half-sliced cake as if that would hold the world in better order. "Not a ghost, my dear," he replied with a grunt. "Only a man who seems to have business beyond our hedges. I don't like people who meddle for their own ends." Dolly patted his arm. "Now, Arthur, you always think the worst." "We'll see. Perhaps he'll be a pleasant companion for the vicarage parties. At any rate, he has enlivened the afternoon, and that is no small thing." Colonel Bantry smoked again, letting the curls of blue wind themselves into the last of the light. He still carried the sentence he had heard like an unfinished telegram. "You have no right to conceal the truth," he repeated to himself, a little absently, and insisted that it would make a good topic for gossip at the club. To others, however, it was nothing more than one of those phrases that the countryside stores away for duller days. To Colonel Bantry, slightly offended and slightly intrigued, it suggested a story that might, in time, require unpicking by people like Dr. Haydock and Miss Marple, whose trades were the quiet business of observing and of tending small moral inventories. The roses that Dolly had put in the drawing-room breathed their fragrance into the dusk as the guests dispersed, and the Bantrys settled with their lamps lit and their familiar evening rites. The world, for the moment, regained its domestic balance. But a small, sharp note had been struck that might, should the wind shift, cause a ripple in the village's steady placidity. Chapter 4. An empty chair at breakfast. Breakfast at the Blue Boar was a ritual as dependable as the church bells. The kettle coughed and sighed upon its hob, the brass polished bright by a dozen hands over many years. The mantel clock ticked in its steady, comforting way, and the smell of hot bread and boiling tea had a homely, reassuring quality that made even the most trivial worries seem small. On that particular morning, however, an odd little vacancy had crept into the room's otherwise habitual order. A vacancy at the long table where, the night before, Mr. Alistair Grant had sat with his quiet, well-made air. Mrs. Piper moved with the economy of someone who had tended her inn for a lifetime. She laid a cloth with the neat, practised motions of a woman for whom the smallest details mattered. A saucer at every place, a spoon at each cup, the little dish of marmalade set near the butter. She hummed, not unkindly, to herself as she worked, while the few early patrons settled into their accustomed seats. Miss Hartnell came in with a soft smile and a small basket of knitting. A farmer took up a corner by the fire and began to talk in low tones of markets and seed. The clock marked the passing of the quarter with its respectful chime. Miss Marple was there, as she had been most mornings lately, enjoying the mild sociability of the inn. Dolly Bantry had been in particularly high spirits the previous day about the new guest, and the village, which likes a ripple in its otherwise still water, had been curious to see how Mr. Grant would settle. That he had been a pleasant companion in the evening had been agreed. That he had the look of a man who liked his papers put in order had been remarked upon. For the moment, the room hummed with ordinary conversation while Mrs. Piper moved from table to table with her brisk, economical manners. It was Miss Marple who first noticed the chair. The place at the head of the long table neatly pushed in, a napkin folded beside the saucer, seemed, by mere contrast, to call attention to itself. A cup had been left solitary, a faint smear of marmalade upon its plate. Mrs. Piper, tidying as she spoke, paused at the doorway, as though something had tugged at her habitual calm. "Odd," she said, aloud more to herself than to others. "Mr. Grant didn't come down to breakfast yet. I thought he would be the sort to have a cup first thing." "I'm sure he'll come," Dolly put in cheerfully, cutting another neat slice from the half-sliced fruitcake she had brought the day before. She set it down with that air of proprietorial ease which made any slight change of plan seem only a small inconvenience. Mrs. Piper, being an innkeeper with a tacit knowledge of the sorts of small troubles strangers sometimes have, nodded and went up the narrow stairs to the rooms. Miss Marple watched her go, the soft rustle of skirt and the steady motion of the landlady's step fitting neatly into the ordinary economy of the house. The kettle continued its faint hissing. The mantel clock ticked with a patient beat. No one yet suspected that the quiet would break into something of a different order. She knocked gently at the door of the long room. There was no answer. Mrs. Piper knocked again and, when no voice replied, tried the handle. The door was locked. A small frown crossed the landlady's face. She turned to the key ring at her waist and found the right key without fuss. The key turned with the soft ease of a lock that has been used often and properly. Mrs. Piper drew the door open. What she saw made the neat framework of the room take a new and terrible shape. Mr. Alistair Grant sat inclined in an armchair by the window, head slightly bent as though in sleep. The dispatch box he had brought with him the night before lay at his feet, closed. A folded paper rested atop it. On the little side table, a teacup lay on its saucer, its contents partly spilled and leaving a faint brown trail across the wood. The light fell upon his face, which had lost its colour and seemed, in the instant of discovery, very still. Mrs. Piper's hand went to the small bell by the washstand. She pulled it with an urgency that made the sound sharp in the corridor. Within minutes, the Blue Boar's usual domesticity was broken. Miss Hartnell, in her neat cap, was beside Mrs. Piper, knitting forgotten in her lap. Dolly and Colonel Bantry, summoned by a quick message, arrived breathless. Dr. Haydock, who had been at his surgery a short drive away, had come on seeing constables at the door, and, within another small space of time, Inspector Slack presented himself with that brisk officiousness which belongs to his station. There was no outward sign of disorder. Mr. Grant's coat had been folded across the arm of the chair. His hat rested upon a nearby stool. The room held itself in that kind of ordinary stillness that makes absence itself feel like a thing. Mrs. Piper, whose face had gone pale, murmured, "I thought, well, sometimes folk sleep in. I thought he might have overslept." Dr. Haydock moved with the sort of respectful promptitude which one expects of a man of his profession. He bent, gently, and felt for the pulse at the wrist. There was no flutter, and the physician's face, practised in the manner of a man who sees much and who must be exact, did not relax. He lifted the teacup and, almost as a way of habit, held it near his nose. For a moment he seemed to consider nothing but that small act. "There is a faint scent," he said, in his quiet, matter-of-fact tone. "Something like bitter almonds." The words fell into the room and changed its atmosphere. Bitter almonds. The phrase itself has a small cunning. To some ears it may mean little, but to others it rings with a technical precision. Miss Marple, who had, in another conversation only days before, seen the faint smudge of ink upon Mr. Grant's fingers, moved forward with that unobtrusive interest which was her way. Inspector Slack, who preferred matters to be quickly wrapped up so that certainty might be declared, and the village returned to its ordinary mood, was visibly impatient of such a subtlety. "A good many things can bring on death suddenly," he said briskly. "A man of his age could be an embolism, could be natural causes." He folded his hands and gave that small, decisive look which signalled the end of speculation and the beginning, in his mind, of routine. But Dr. Haydock's face kept the quiet thought of a man considering more than the surface. "I should like to take him to the surgery for a proper examination," he said. "The smell is suggestive. For now, well, we must not say anything to the village until we know." He looked up at Inspector Slack with an air of professional entreaty rather than confrontation. Miss Marple, gentle as ever in her manner, yet with a precision of interest that had seen many small human puzzles, asked, simply, "Who prepared Mr. Grant's tea this morning?" Mrs. Piper's fingers trembled a little as she smoothed the cloth. "I do the breakfasts," she answered, in a voice that suggested she felt the question's intimacy. "I put the pot on the hob, and I made his cup, as I always do. He likes it strong." I knocked, and when there was no reply, I let myself use the key. Everything was as I'd left it, his chair, his papers, his dispatch box. Only the cup. Well, it smelled odd, but I thought perhaps I had burnt the pot. She blinked, as if to shake away a picture she did not wish to hold. The assembled people exchanged those small looks which, in a village, are the beginnings of conjecture. Colonel Bantry, pipe momentarily unlit, as his mouth formed a small appraising frown, muttered in a voice that aimed at being calm, "Locked room, is it? That would point to some natural cause. Men go in their sleep." Dolly, attempting to hold the world together with hospitable good sense, insisted that they should not jump to any dreadful conclusions. "Now, Arthur, we have to let the doctor and the inspector do their jobs. There's no sense in frightening everyone. Mr. Grant was a pleasant gentleman. Perhaps he took something by mistake. People do sometimes confuse medicines." But the phrase Dr. Haydock had used, bitter almonds, had lodged. Miss Hartnell, softly, covered her mouth with a handkerchief. Mrs. Price Ridley, who had been ready to place Mr. Grant among costumes of Bath and memory, found herself suddenly at a loss for amusement. Inspector Slack, who preferred tidy ends and clear causes, made a practical note. "Very well. We will remove the body for a proper examination, and in the meantime I'll have to ask who saw him last and who had cause to enter his room. No one is to touch anything." His manner was brisk, meant to reassure, but it could not entirely erase the hush that had fallen. Miss Marple did not speak loudly, nor did she seek to dramatize the moment. She edged a little nearer to where the dispatch box lay closed and observed, as she always observed, small things that the more dramatic mind might miss. A faint dampness on the rug where a drop had fallen and not been wiped. The way the teacup had been set a little more to one side than ordinary. And the small, neat impression in the armchair's upholstery, as though the man had shifted shortly before he sank into stillness. She noted, too, the dispatch box's tightness, the brass clasp held as if not expected to be opened hastily. There is nothing theatrical in Miss Marple's attention. It is the slow work of someone who understands that life's small items, taken together, make a pattern. The small revelation that morning that the tea smelled of something like bitter almonds was a pebble dropped into the pond of village life. Its rings had begun. "Doctor," Haydock spoke again, quietly and with professional coolness. "I will have to take him to the surgery and perform a more thorough examination. Bitter almonds are often associated with the presence of certain poisons. I do not wish to make any alarmist statement, but we must be thorough." Inspector Slack, who had the instinct of any good constable to keep a civil calm, nodded, though the lines around his mouth suggested an inward reserve. "Very well, Doctor. We will do this properly. For the present, I should advise discretion. There is no need to tell the village more than that Mr. Grant has died. Suddenly, and that further particulars will be given when we have them. Outside, of course, the high street is not so slow that it must wait for an official statement. Children hurried past on errands, a grocer set out his crates, and within an hour there was the inevitable murmur among the small shops. A matter like a sudden death at the Blue Boar is the sort of thing that a village passes among its households with a furtive interest. And already the rings of talk were widening. Within the inn, however, the hush remained. The chair at breakfast was empty, no longer merely by habit but by absence made large. Miss Marple, with the ready kindness that was part of her nature, stayed to speak a few quiet words to Mrs. Piper, to help fold a cloth and to note the small practicalities. The dispatch box remained closed. The teacup had left its faint, bitter trace. Dr. Haydock would have his examination, and Inspector Slack would begin the careful business of asking who had reasons and who had means. The mini-revelation that this was perhaps not a natural death but one calling for closer attention had taken its place among the household things of the Blue Boar. How it would unfold, whether it would become a drama or a small human tragedy quietly solved, was not yet known. Miss Marple, standing by the mantel as the clock kept its unperturbed count, thought only that the village had been offered a small puzzle, and that puzzles, like knitting, unravel with patient fingers if one has the inclination to sit quietly and watch. Chapter Fem. Village gossip turns dark. The high street of Street Mary Mead wears its news like a shawl in autumn. It is folded about shoulders, passed hand to hand, and knitted afresh until everyone knows the pattern. On the morning after Mr. Grant's death, the shawl was a little heavier than usual. The grocer's steps were busier. The greengrocer spoke a word that had not been there the day before. And the small, comfortable bustle that ordinarily surrounds market day had taken a lean toward curiosity. Miss Marple, who had put on a sensible hat and tucked a basket beneath her arm, went whether she wished to or no. The village news had always been an ingredient in her day, as necessary as her cups of tea and as easily examined. She met the first current of talk at the greengrocer's door. The man behind the counter, a blunt-faced fellow who knew both the weight of a good cabbage and the worth of a good story, nodded in her direction and lowered his voice to a conspiratorial murmur as she took a turn through the rows of apples and carrots. "Well, Miss Marple, you know as well as I do that the Blue Boar's not the kind of place for odd deaths in the parish. What was it they found?" he asked, with the directness of one for whom gossip is a trade as much as veg. Miss Marple smiled the small, indulgent smile she kept for village talk. "They found Mr. Grant not at his breakfast, as I have heard," she said, "and Mrs. Piper went to his room and found him very still. She selected 2 cabbages with efficient fingers and paid without fuss. People say many things," she added, "but one must give the doctor and the inspector time." "Aye. But the point is," He had been asking after parish records and who inherited what. The greengrocer continued, lowering a voice already down to the intimacy of an aside. Mrs. Price Ridley declares he looked like someone she once knew in Bath, and Dr. Haydock and he had words the night before that sounded as if they might have been about more than tea. Colonel Bantry hears he was in the stables at odd hours, all sorts of notions about it. Miss Marple nodded. The items were nothing new to her. The Bath memory which had risen like a pale shadow from Mrs. Price Ridley's habit of seeing fashionable faces in every gentleman. The quarrel with Dr. Haydock, which some took to be a simple difference of opinion and others to mean something more fateful. The Colonel's remark, which would leak among men in the club and grow into something wider. What worried her for the moment was less the particulars than the speed with which they made themselves into a story. She continued along the high street, the basket on her arm filled before long with a small order for the vicarage, a pound of sugar, a jar of marmalade, and a length of ribbon for Griselda's little projects. The ribbon reminded her of Dolly's neatness. And in fact, when she reached Gossington Hall in the late morning, the Bantrys were in the middle of an expedition of conjecture. Dolly had the plate with the half-sliced fruitcake set out on the sideboard as a demonstration of the world's continuity. People mustn't make mountains of molehills, she declared, slicing with decisive cheerfulness. Mr. Grant was a polite man, and politeness is in scarce supply these days. He will be a subject for our small talk, and then all will be well. Spies, perhaps? Said Colonel Bantry with a half-jest that did not entirely mask a soldier's discomfort. Those fellows with dispatch boxes sometimes are not what they seem. Brings me to mind the last fellow who came with papers and a way of looking at fences as if they were his to inspect. He tapped his pipe against the ashtray with a gruff little noise and stared, as men do, into a remembered annoyance. Dolly laughed away the notion with the comfortable domesticity that made gossip itself an amiable exercise. "Oh, Arthur, you are fantastical. Spies in Street Mary Mead indeed. Our biggest scandal will be whether Mrs. Price Ridley's new bonnet is to the left or the right of her last. But one cannot blame people for talking. They must have something to do with their mornings." The talk at Gossington Hall took that shape half serious, half humorous, until Griselda Clement, always gentle and a little grave, mentioned something that drew more attention than she intended. "Mary," she said, nodding as if to a memory of some small service. "The vicarage maid, she called by the Blue Boar yesterday with a parcel. Reverend. Leonard had asked her to deliver it when he was occupied with a visiting parishioner. Nothing seemed amiss then. But later, thinking it over, I wondered at the presence of the parcel at the inn. It seemed an odd thing to send." Dolly paused with cake poised between fork and plate, and for a moment the room filled with a different kind of attentiveness. The idea of a parcel from the vicarage at the inn had the right twist to make speculation broaden. What had been ordinary a girl taking a parcel for convenience was now transmuted into an act that might mean more. Colonel Bantry, who liked certainty and disliked loose edges to stories, said in his blunt sort, "Well, I heard someone, Mrs. Piper, perhaps say that the parcel had been left by the maid and was small and wrapped in brown paper. It might have been seeds, it might have been something for the vicarage. But one would expect the vicar to keep his things at the vicarage. Why leave parcels at an inn?" Dolly, whose imagination and appetite both liked a diversion, began to spin small theories with the pleased energy of one who enjoys a puzzle warmed by tea. "It might have been letters," she suggested, "or perhaps some small trinket that belonged to an old family. Think of romances, think of long-lost cousins. Perhaps Mr. Grant was forming a little campaign to tidy up old inheritances." She said it as a pleasant possibility, and for Dolly, a pleasant possibility was almost as good as a confirmed fact. Miss Marple, listening, remembered clearly the small brown parcel she had seen the day before when she had called for a quiet cup at the Blue Boar. It had been wrapped in coarse paper and tied in plain string, with Reverend Clement's neat hand on the tag for Mr. Grant. From the vicarage. The parcel had seemed, at the time, precisely the sort of commonplace thing a vicar might send. Seeds, a small book, perhaps a note. But now, with the memory of the dispatch box and the man's inquiries about petty inheritances, the parcel took on another hue. She did not, however, jump to conclusions. Miss Marple had long learned that many things which shine at first glance are later found to be mere gilding. A parcel, she observed, could hold many harmless things. A dispatch box could hold only papers. If one placed those items side by side, the mind might be tempted to infer neat conspiracies. But the village, as she well knew, liked to weave its own dramas in the absence of evidence. By midday, the whispering had spread. Mrs. Price Ridley, heard at the grocer's with an audience of 2 earnest housewives, insisted that she had almost certainly met Mr. Grant in Bath long ago. "I am quite sure of it," she declared, with fingers that fiddled at her fan. "He had that very look about him, decided and foreign. I knew at once. I had seen him in a place where one is accustomed to fashionable men." Miss Hartnell, who disliked to be in the centre of speculation, though she never failed to know an occasion when one should be polite, suggested gently that appearances might deceive. "One should not be too quick to make identity the driver of our talk," she said, fingers busy with a soft stitch. "There is grief enough in the world without weaving new needles for it." Another voice, a man who had been in the nightclub of gossip at the post office, said he had seen a figure moving near the stables the previous night. "Sounded like someone in boots, late," he reported, as if the detail were at once sinister and yet perhaps trivial. Colonel Bantry, taking the note up a little eagerly now, remembered how, indeed, there had been an uneven pattern of footfalls near the stable door one night past when he had risen to fetch his pipe. He had not thought much of it at the time. Now, with a man's overnight death to weigh against it, the sound became a possible clue. It is in moments such as these that a village's small mechanisms of rumour, memory, and conjecture set themselves in motion. Each ring in the water draws other rings. Each small observation is polished into a shard of evidence. Dollies and colonels have a way of peopling gaps with motives, and the public mind, like the greengrocer's scales, will weigh a dozen small things until some pattern is imagined. Miss Marple's opinion, which rarely made much noise when formed, was that the parcel bore watching, but that one should be careful to separate the ordinary from the essential. "People leave parcels for convenience," she told Dolly in a low voice as they walked back toward the Blue Boar. Mary at the vicarage would have thought nothing of taking a parcel to the inn. The vicar himself is more busy than most. Sometimes, small things are done for the sake of neighbourliness. It is possible, of course, that the parcel and Mr. Grant's box are in some way connected, but it is just as possible that they are only 2 separate small matters that happen to arrive at once. Dolly, not wholly satisfied but relieved to have given the mind some exercise, agreed to a point, and then returned to more friendly talk of next week's tea parties. Colonel Bantry smoked, content for the moment to let the world be considered in its tea-time proportions, though his mind would not quite let the matter rest. High Street murmurs continued to collect in his mind like leaves blown into a corner. He had been a soldier. Once a soldier, always an observer of the small indications that tell of change. By late afternoon, the Blue Boar, for all its kettle and its clock, had become an odd focus of attention. Mrs. Piper moved between cups and customers with a practised face. She had already said to several callers that the parcel had contained catalogues of seeds, which was, as Miss Marple suspected, an ordinary enough piece of business. But the idea that something which seemed perfectly innocent might be read as something else had already taken hold in the village imagination. Miss Marple, who never liked to stir the pot of talk but liked to taste its broth, sat quietly with a cup and watched the village sort itself into its comfortable pattern of suspicion. A parcel, a sound in the stables, a memory of Bath. These were stitches that might, when pulled, unravel trivialities rather than mysteries, or they might not. The task of unpicking them would be patient and gentle. Miss Marple had all the patience required. Chapter 6. Slack's Theories. By the time the little cluster of villagers and officials had gathered in the back room of the Blue Boar, the place had resumed, in a tentative fashion, something of its ordinary air. The brass kettle had been polished and set aside. A fresh pot of tea steamed on a side table, as if to reassure the world that some things remained the same. The mantel clock kept its regular, unperturbed tick. Yet an edge of official business had been laid over the domestic routine. Inspector Slack, neat and brisk even when his mood was less than sunny, had brought with him a small pile of papers. Dr. Haydock, with the professional gravity that suited him, had his surgical notebook, and Miss Marple had come, as usual, with a small, composed look that put others at their ease. Dolly Bantry presided over the makeshift meeting with the hospitable air that had always been her way of containing events. The half-sliced cake stood on the sideboard as a reminder that hospitality was a refuge, even when a village felt itself in the midst of a perturbation. Colonel Bantry puffed at his pipe with the intermittent impatience of a man who dislikes uncertainty, and Griselda Clement had come from the vicarage with a shawl about her shoulders and a gentle look of concern. Mrs. Price Ridley hovered near the window with an expression that suggested she was ready to supply reminiscences at a moment's notice. Inspector Slack did not delay in setting out what he regarded as the salient points. He spoke in a rapid, efficient tone, the manner of a man who likes his world to be bounded and his tasks tidy. Right then. We have a death at the Blue Boar. The door to the room in which Mr. Grant lay was locked from within when Mrs. Piper went to his door this morning. The dispatch box was found closed. There were letters in the box addressed to various people. One's a letter to someone up in London, another to a local lady. On preliminary view, the scene gives every appearance of a man who has taken his own life. Locked room. Private room. Papers in a private box. It would be a tidy end to a man's affairs. His tone left little room for the other possibilities. Slack's mind, practical and official, liked neatness. A cause and an effect which explained itself. He paused, as if to let the village release a breath and return to its usual pace. The clock clicked. Dolly poured him a second cup of tea, as if to soothe his briskness with something domestic. Do you believe it's suicide, poison, or something stranger? Comment your suspect below. The parenthetical remark had meaning in the peculiar economy of village news. It was the moment a community might be asked to take sides, to record an opinion. Slack, however, returned to his briskness without pausing for the commentary of the town. Dr. Haydock, who had been listening with the calm scrutiny of a man whose trade is to know what hides beneath appearances, cleared his throat. "Inspector," he said, speaking slowly and with the precise caution of a physician, "we must not close the book on this without a proper examination. Grant to the surgery and perform the usual tests. The body bears the signs, to my professional eye, consistent with the presence of a poison. There was the same faint note of bitter almonds at the scene and upon the clothing, and the internal examination indicates the presence of a rapidly acting alkaloid. I would say cautiously that there is cause to believe the death was not merely natural." Inspector Slack, who had hoped perhaps to tidy the matter into the simplest recourse, frowned slightly. "Aye, but the locked room and the letters," he began, as if to pile one straightforward fact on top of another. Dolly, unable to keep worry from her voice, put a hand to her mouth. "Letters? What letters? Who wrote to whom?" Inspector Slack tapped a sheet of paper as if to underline his point. The dispatch box Mr. Grant kept closed had several papers in it. Among them were a couple of letters, one in his hand, one apparently in another. The presence of a personal letter makes it seem as though he knew what he intended to do and arranged his affairs. That would make it a suicide, in my view. There is, in such cases, an economy to explain things. He spoke the last word with the sort of finality that keeps constables in good stead with their superiors. Miss Marple, who had been watching the exchange with that gentle attention which had long been her trade, leaned forward a little. "Inspector," she said, softly, "may I see the letters, please? If you will allow me a very quiet look, merely as someone who has had a good deal of practice putting two and two together about small things." Slack, with a faint impatience but without ostentation, slid the dispatch box across the table. The brass catch opened with a little sigh of aged metal. Inside were papers folded with care. An envelope lay on top, addressed to someone in London in a hand that had a tidy slant. Beneath it were 4 more letters, their content not read aloud by Slack but placed gently before Miss Marple. She lifted them with a dexterity that had nothing theatrical but everything of curiosity. The first letter she opened was in a neat, careful hand, steady strokes, the sort of hand that belongs to someone trained to write well. The second, however, was of a different character. More hurried, a little shakier in the lower cases, with certain letters formed in an odd, inconsistent fashion. Miss Marple's fingers paused. She had not yet read a word aloud, but the small thing that caught her eye. 2 hands told her more, perhaps, than mere phrases would. "There are 2 hands here," she observed, without drama. One is quieter and more formal. The other is well. It is not the same. They differ in several letters formation. See how the G curves here, but perhaps that is nothing. Dr. Haydock's eyes, trained to notice signs, widened a little. 2 hands, he echoed. That would be curious. Forged letters can be done for many reasons. 2 hands might mean more than one writer, or perhaps a disguised hand. We must be careful. Slack. Folding his arms with the gesture of a man who does not easily accept that his neat theory might need reweaving, said, "Even so, one might have written farewell notes, and another could be a business reply. I do not see a great mystery if Mr. Grant set his house in order." Miss Marple tapped the edge of one sheet with the tip of her finger. "There is also," she said, quietly, "the matter of the way the ink lies. One letter is written with an even, leisurely hand and there are tiny smudges at the margin. The other is hurried. It is often, in my experience, the case that people whose trades involve careful copying and forging will have an ink which lies differently." But I would not say anything without more thought. Griselda, who had been listening with a soft attentiveness that made space for others to speak, asked in a low voice, "Do you think any of this would point against such an explanation, Inspector? Would an arrangement of letters not be natural for a man to prepare?" Dolly, with a nervous little laugh that did not quite hide her anxiety, said, "One must not be a coward of the mind, but the very idea of Mr. Grant going so quietly he'll be missed. Still, if Dr. Haydock says poison, then there is cause for concern." Dr. Haydock, who had, in his professional capacity, no love for theatrical pronouncements but a sincere respect for thoroughness, repeated in a steady voice that the autopsy results made the presence of poison probable. "I cannot yet state with complete technical certainty without sending samples for analysis," he said. "But the signs are consistent. Bitter almond notes, the speed of onset, and the internal presentation lead me to believe a poison acted. We must await chemical confirmation. For the moment it would be imprudent to say more publicly than that a thorough examination is necessary." Inspector Slack, to whom awaiting chemical confirmation felt like a delaying of the proper course, folded the matter up with a briskness characteristic of his office. "Very well," he said. "We'll have it all proper. In the meantime, I shall provisionally record this as an apparent suicide. We shall make inquiries and see what the parish and Mr. Grant's acquaintances have to say. But there is no need to alarm the village unduly." Miss Marple's mouth gave that subtle little smile which is not a sign of amusement but of understanding. She did not challenge the inspector's authority. She simply had, in her quiet way, the habit of filing small things in her mind, so that patterns emerge later. 2 hands in the dispatch box were now one of those small things. Ink smudges and the presence of a neat letter suggested, perhaps, correspondence. These were notes which might be used by those who wished to close a case, or by those who intended to open one. As the meeting broke up, Dolly and Griselda found themselves drifting together in the hallway, voices a little lower than usual. Dolly, nervous but brave of heart, rattled off the names she had heard in passing, as if listing ingredients of a recipe for solace. Price Ridley said she thought she had seen him in Bath. Colonel Arthur said there was noise in the stables. People in the high street say words. It is terrible. Her fingers toyed with the fringe of the shawl she had lent Griselda. Griselda, who was given to the quiet charity of trying to make sense of human motives, said, "One must not rush. People in grief are clumsy at conversation. They must be handled gently." "But I wonder, Dolly, whether some small persons might have been upset by Mr. Grant's questions. Questions about who had goods and who had rights. Those are matters that sometimes unsettle people more than we imagine." Dolly sighed. "Oh, I don't know. Arthur says spies. I think he means mischief. But perhaps the simplest explanation is the truest. Even so, it gives one a taste of being in a play one has not rehearsed for." Miss Marple walked out into the late afternoon with the little clarity she favoured. She had tea with her thoughts, and her mind put side by side the small fax-locked door, dispatch box with letters in 2 hands, the doctor's suggestion of poison. It was not her way to arrive at conclusions in haste. She believed, as she had often told Dolly and others, that conscience works slowly and leaves its marks in trivial places, a hesitation in speech, a smudge of ink, a parcel left by the vicarage that an innocent maid had once delivered. For the moment the village must be patient with its news, and Miss Marple, who had the lifetime's habit of watching the most innocent of details, kept her attention ready. Chapter 7. Threads of the Past. The afternoon in street. Mary Mead was of the sort one associates with an old postcard, a mellow light that softened the edges of rooftops, a thin mist clinging to hedgerows, and the faint smell of damp earth after a light shower. Miss Marple, walking with careful steps along the lane, reflected that mysteries had a way of hiding themselves behind such ordinary weather. The roses in her own cottage window box had begun to drop their petals, and she thought, with her usual mild practicality, that she must sweep them before evening, lest they stain the sill. She did not get far before she was intercepted, if that is the right word, by Mrs. Price Ridley, whose presence always seemed to descend like a cold draught through an open door. Dressed as ever, in black that had known better days, she had the air of one who bore both duty and grievance in equal measure. "My dear Miss Marple," she began, lowering her voice, though they were alone on the lane. This business at the inn, shocking of course. But really, one could hardly expect otherwise, considering the man's past. Miss Marple looked at her gently. "You mean Mr. Grant's past?" A faint colour, almost indignation, rose in Mrs. Price Ridley's cheeks. She adjusted her gloves. "I had hoped it would not be necessary to mention it, but I see concealment serves no purpose. The fact is, many years ago he was engaged to my cousin Clara." "Clara?" "Clara Preston, before she married into the Titheridges." Miss Marple did indeed recall a shy young woman with downcast eyes and a fondness for embroidered collars. Yes, indeed, a sweet disposition. Sweet, but weak, Mrs. Price Ridley declared. The engagement ended in scandal. There were whispers of impropriety, of money lost and debts unsettled. Clara never recovered, and when she married it was more from resignation than from affection. That Mr. Grant should reappear now, years later, lodging at the Blue Boar, is to my mind more than coincidence, though of course I do not wish to suggest anything improper. Miss Marple inclined her head with mild sympathy. But her mind was busy. A broken engagement scandal, debts, such things often left traces long after the people concerned had departed. Later that same day, at Gossington Hall, Colonel Bantry provided a different angle, though with his usual bluff manner. He was in the garden when Miss Marple arrived with Dolly, a pipe clamped firmly between his teeth and a basket of seed catalogues at his elbow. "Dashed funny business," he said, when Dolly obligingly drew the conversation round to the inn. "That fellow Grant, I'd swear I'd heard his name years back. Something to do with tea plantations. Fraudulent shipments, they said. Post-war years, mind you, men trying to make a quick penny. Can't prove a thing now, of course. All the records muddled, half the estates bankrupt, but the name rings a bell. One remembers such things. Colonel, you always say names ring bells." Dolly teased, setting down a fruitcake already sliced upon the garden table. "But perhaps in this case it truly does mean something." Miss Marple smiled, pouring tea with a steady hand. She had learned long ago that a soldier's vague memory often proved more accurate than he himself suspected. "I wonder," she murmured, "whether such recollections might be more than coincidence. One must be careful with patterns, though they so easily lead the eye astray." The pattern continued to weave itself in Miss Marple's mind that evening, when she made her way to the vicarage. The Reverend Clement, ever obliging, brought out the parish registers, their thick bindings creaking faintly. Griselda, bright and curious, sat nearby, her knitting needles clicking as if to punctuate the silence. The old volumes gave off a faint smell of dust and candle grease. Miss Marple's finger, delicate and unhurried, traced down the neat columns of births, marriages, and deaths. Names she had known all her life appeared in ordered succession. Hartnell, Price Ridley, Weatherby. Yet at one entry she paused. The ink seemed uneven darker at first, then fading as though someone had touched it later. A small loop in a letter was clumsily reshaped. To most eyes it would have passed unnoticed, but Miss Marple had always prided herself on seeing the tiny things others overlooked. The mismatched stitch in a sampler, the slightly altered button on a cuff. "Is something amiss?" the vicar asked, peering over her shoulder. "It is very curious," Miss Marple said softly. This entry, an inheritance noted beside Clara Preston's name, appears to have been amended. One might almost think someone wished to change the record of who was entitled to what. Griselda looked up sharply. You mean fraud? Miss Marple folded her hands. One would not wish to use so strong a word without reflection, but it does suggest that money, or property, might have been at stake, and perhaps more recently than we imagine. The vicar frowned, his hand resting on the open page. Surely such tampering would not have gone unnoticed? Oh, one would be surprised, dear Leonard, Miss Marple said kindly. Very small alterations, made quietly, are often overlooked. Clerks grow weary, vicars change, and no one thinks to look unless a death occurs under questionable circumstances. They sat a moment in silence, the only sound the steady tick of the vicarage clock. Outside, dusk settled gently over the village, and the faint chatter of sparrows in the hedges made a soft accompaniment to Miss Marple's thoughts. As she rose to leave, she looked once more at the altered entry. Mrs. Price Ridley's reluctant confession, the Colonel's vague memory of tea estate fraud, and now this quiet but unmistakable tampering in the parish record. Each detail was slight, almost trivial. Yet together they formed a pattern not unlike the patchwork she so often stitched of an evening. Fragments, uneven and humble, but when joined, gave shape to something definite. And in that pattern, Mr. Grant's death no longer appeared a sudden accident or an isolated tragedy. Rather, it seemed woven into the long memory of the village itself. Threads of scandal, money, and betrayal stretching back through the years, ready to ensnare again when the time was ripe. Miss Marple, with her serene smile, drew her shawl closer. She did not yet voice her conclusions. It was not her way to force the pattern too soon, but in her heart she knew. The past had not merely returned, it had been waiting. Chapter Wit, False Leads, Unraveled. The roses in Miss Marple's window boxes were opening bravely against the September air, their soft petals dusted faintly with dew. She had been clipping a few tired leaves that morning, her secateurs precise, when the flutter of Mrs. Price Ridley's voice drifted from the lane. Miss Hartnell was with her. The two women moving at the speed of gossip, eager to deposit the latest theory upon the village. Dr. Haydock, it appeared, was in the crosshairs of their imagination. Mrs. Price Ridley, leaning heavily on her parasol, declared she had always suspected a certain brusqueness in his manner, and brusqueness, in her view, was only one step away from cruelty. Miss Hartnell contributed that she had once seen the doctor carry a parcel into the Blue Boar's back door, and parcels, after all, were suspicious things when men died suddenly. Miss Marple listened, her head bent low over her roses. She murmured something sympathetic, but her eyes were bright and knowing. She had observed Dr. Haydock too many times, his careful listening to old Mrs. Bartlett's endless complaints of chilblains, his patience with Griselda Clement when she panicked over the baby's first fever, the way he tucked his notebook away with the air of one burdened but steady. Such a man might be curt, but he was not careless with life. And, more to the point, he had been among the first to insist that a post-mortem was necessary. That, Miss Marple reflected, was not the instinct of a guilty man. Later that morning she took tea with Dolly Bantry in the sunny drawing-room of Gossington Hall. Dolly had arrayed a splendid spread fruitcake, naturally, already sliced, and waiting, and her eyes shone with the delight of the chase. "My dear Jane," Dolly said, lowering her voice as though the Colonel might be hiding behind the curtains, "I am more and more convinced it must be Mrs. Price Ridley. So proud, so determined, and her family always so particular about money. I dare say she might have reason enough. And don't you think she is cleverer than she looks?" Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. A little shawl for the vicarage infant growing row by row. She gave a small smile. "I think, Dolly dear, that Mrs. Price Ridley is in fact precisely as clever as she looks. She may guard her opinions closely, but she has never concealed her dislikes, nor her occasional enthusiasm for scandal. A truly cunning person, you know, is often far less inclined to speak." Dolly looked somewhat crestfallen. "Then who? For someone must have done it." It cannot be the wind or the teapot itself that poisons. The conversation was interrupted by the colonel coming in with a whiff of pipe smoke. He had been in the stable. Or so he said. And his boots confirmed it. All this whispering about Haydock, he announced, is absolute rot. The man sound as a bell. If anything, I'd wager on some infernal, misdelivered parcel. At this, Miss Marple allowed herself a little inward smile. Parcel again. Everyone had seen, or thought they had seen, the vicarage maid carrying something into the Blue Boar that week. It had grown in the telling, of course, from a modest brown paper bundle into a heavy chest of secrets. The truth, Miss Marple knew, was at once simpler and more telling about the village itself. That afternoon, Miss Marple stopped at the vicarage. Griselda was there, bright and rather flustered, fussing over Leonard Clement's sermon notes. When asked, the young maid confirmed the errand at once. "Oh yes, ma'am. I took a packet to the inn for Mrs. Clement. Only the seed catalogues come in, you see. And she thought Mrs. Biddle at the Blue Boar might like to look before ordering her geraniums for spring." Miss Marple nodded, satisfied. Seed catalogues, of all things, the very stuff of village life, bright pages of hopeful blossoms to be thumbed through over tea. She could almost hear Dolly's disappointment when she learned the truth. Yet it was exactly such small truths that cleared away fog. High Street, later that week, was alive with speculation. The polished brass kettle in the Blue Boar ticked comfortably on the hob, while at the greengrocer's, voices rose and fell over lettuces and gossip. Theories spun wildly, each villager tugging some remembered slight, some observed oddity, into a net meant to catch guilt. Miss Hartnell declared that a man from Bath, as Mr. Grant had been, was bound to have shady acquaintances. Mrs. Price Ridley herself hinted, with a flutter of lace handkerchief, that Dr. Haydock's late-night calls might mask darker purposes. Through it all, Miss Marple walked quietly, her pale eyes thoughtful. She carried her string bag, filled with a small cauliflower and a pat of butter wrapped neatly in paper. But her true burden was the sifting of human nature. She had seen such patterns before. Villagers seizing upon the obvious, the dramatic, and rarely upon the subtle. And she, Jane Marple, had made a life study of the subtle. At her cottage that evening, roses glowing faintly against the window-panes, Miss Marple sat with her tea. The little brass kettle hummed on the hob. She spread out her notes, no more than a few scraps tucked under her sewing basket, and reflected. The parcel had been nothing. Dr. Haydock's brusqueness was honesty rather than malice. Mrs. Price Ridley's pride, though real, lacked the stillness of craft that true cunning required. Piece by piece, the false leads fell away like autumn leaves from a tree. Her deductions did not thunder. They whispered, as her roses whispered in the wind. But they prevailed, clearing the ground. What remained was the truth, still half hidden, but nearer now. Chapter 9. The Tea That Wasn't. Miss Marple's little kitchen smelled of boiled water and lemon polish that morning, the same reassuring domestic scents that had accompanied all the small discoveries of her life. The brass kettle on the hob took its time to sing. The roses outside the window, already trimmed for autumn, cast a pale pink light across the table. She set out 3 different cups, one for herself, one for a visitor, and one to use in a small experiment, each a different pattern, each with its own familiar nick or gilded rim. The mismatched china had always comforted her. Each cup a personality, each saucer a history. There was a method to the experiment. Miss Marple had an old habit of reconstructing ordinary acts in order to find the extraordinary thing hidden inside them. She had taken careful note, in the days since Mr. Grant's death, of who entered rooms at what time in the Blue Boar, of the manner in which Mrs. Piper set a tray, of the small economy of an inn where nothing was wasted and everything had its appointed place. If the manner of serving a single cup of tea could be rehearsed at her own table, she thought perhaps she could see, in miniature, how a cup might be tampered with, and who would have the chance to do it. She measured the leaves the way she had seen Mrs. Piper do 2 generous spoons for a pot. She boiled the water to a proper roll, not that anxious bubbling of underboiled things, and poured with the steady hand of practice She placed a teaspoon on each saucer and set 2 lumps of sugar beside 1 cup, 3 by the other, because Mrs. Piper always remembered who liked how many lumps. Miss Hartnell, 2. Mr. Grant, she had heard, preferred it strong. She set a small silver teaspoon atop a folded napkin and stirred 1 cup with slow, even circles, noting how the spoon left a tiny wake which reached to one side of the cup. It was an unremarkable wake, no more than a small ridge in the surface, but it made her think of the way a cup is left when a person has only set it down for a moment. Miss Marple drank a small sip, not to taste, but to reenact the manner in which someone might set a cup down and leave it. The cup she had set on the little bench nearest the window felt oddly central, as if it might, in another place, be the one that had been put to the lip. The exercise had the gentle absurdity of a child's play, but it was the very kind of absurdity that often produced useful facts. Who cleans a teacup? Who fetches a refill? Who goes up to a guest's room with a tray and who is left outside by convention? She thought of Mrs. Piper's keys, which she carried, not ostentatiously, but with the casual possession of experience. Innkeepers have a right to go where guests are, and to make sure rooms are comfortable. They see what strangers do not. The state of a visitor's papers, the way a jacket flops on a chair, the placement of a cup at the side table. Miss Marple imagined the neat little tray making its polite journey up the Blue Boar stairs. Mrs. Piper's hand steady on the handle of the tray as she knocked and, perhaps, entered when no answer was given. A key would have been used, a door opened, a cup set, and if someone wished to put something into that cup, it would have been an easy motion to make by a practised hand. Only, she remembered, the door to Mr. Grant's room had been locked from within when Mrs. Piper first tried it. That had been the puzzle Inspector Slack most liked. The locked room suggested a private act, but Miss Marple had always considered locks to be often as theatrical as they were secure. There are many moments before the proper breakfast hour at an inn when a man might be given his morning cup in his own room by the landlady herself. There are also moments when a cup might be left in the small, private sitting room and taken back to a bedside. The essential fact, she thought as she lifted her cup to her lips, was this. The only people who had free, unobserved access to Mr. Grant's room were, for the most part, Mrs. Piper and her small household. Guests tend to sleep in peace or to rouse themselves. Strangers do not usually have entry to a locked room unless invited by the occupant or by the holder of the key. She set the empty cup down and opened the dispatch box which she had, by Slack's sought permission, had been allowed to see some days before. The dispatch box was small, battered, leather worn in from travel, and it had a faint scent of tobacco and old paper. Inside the letters were still folded, oilskin rubbing at the corners, the ink a variety of browns and blacks. She spread them out on the table beside her knitting. Miss Marple had seen these papers before on Slack's tidy table, but she had not studied them as closely as she now intended. There were letters in a neat, practised hand, regular loops and flourishes, and others in a more hurried script where the writer's haste had skewed the lines. In one sheet there was a blot where the writer had paused and dragged a blotting paper over a wet nose of ink. On the edge of another there was the faint smudge as though a thumb had been drawn across fresh ink. Miss Marple's finger traced that smudge absently, and then came away with a faint hint of the same dark brown on her fingertip. Her memory went back to the Blue Boar itself, where, that first afternoon, she had noticed a small thing. Mr. Grant's right-hand nails bore dark streaks at the edges, as though some ink had lodged beneath the cuticle. It had seemed incongruous then. A planter has hands stained with leaves and soil, not with script. But here, with the letters spread before her, the smudge made a small, sensible concord. A man who handled forged or heavily annotated papers might, by habit or necessity, show signs of his work upon his person. Miss Marple took another letter and read it slowly. The phrasing was careful, courteous, but beneath its formal politeness, there lay small, insistent requests that hinted at an intention. It has come to my attention that certain entries require correction. One line read, and I should be most obliged to assist in their clarification for a modest consideration. The tone was insinuating rather than threatening, an invitation to consult a gentleman who seemed able to tidy up small legal embarrassments. Another page, in the hurried hand, carried the more direct note. If the matter is not resolved by cash consideration, I will, with regret, see that the discrepancies are brought to light. It was not an explicit blackmail as loud as a street trumpet. It was the quieter, more poisonous kind that insinuates itself in the spaces of proper parlours and parish rooms. Miss Marple folded her hands and sat back in her chair, the little brass kettle clicking softly on the hob, as if it had been waiting for her to reach a conclusion. 2 hands, one confident, one hurried. An ink-smudged thumb. Letters that hinted at corrections for a modest consideration. The parish register she had seen at the vicarage, with its clumsy later hand amending an earlier note that placed land in a different name. This lay now beside the letters like a puzzle piece. The altered entry in the register, she thought, had not been the work of a clerk's idle mistake. It had the look of someone who wished paper to reflect a reality the world had not yet agreed to. Someone, in short, had been attempting to make documents sing for their supper. She thought again of the ink beneath Mr. Grant's nails. It would be a simple thing, she reflected, for a forger to blot his fingers as he worked. It would be equally simple to clean them of any telltale trace. Grant, if he were the one handling such papers, had not kept that caution. Perhaps he had tried to imitate the hand of a gentleman of the parish. Perhaps he had been bold enough to write his own proof. Perhaps he had been the person arranging the forged corrections in order to gain leverage over old families. That a man who called himself a planter would carry such signs was an oddity. That the dispatch box contained letters coyly mentioning corrections was less odd and more telling. A small, clear shape came into Miss Marple's mind like a well-placed stitch. The man who sat in the Blue Boar with his tales of tea and distant plantations was, she now suspected, not what he claimed. He was a man who wrote letters suggesting he could adjust parish records for a modest consideration. He had altered the parish record to his benefit, or to the benefit of someone who paid him, and he had the ink upon his nails to show he handled ink as part of his work. He was no planter in the romantic sense. He was a forger, an impostor, who trafficked in the old village's quiet intimacies. In short, quietly, without theatricality, he had been a blackmailer. The realization did not explode into accusation. It settled, gentle as a dawn, in Miss Marple's breast. She sipped her tea and looked out at the roses. These small lives, she thought, seemed together in ways most people do not notice. A broken engagement, an altered register, hints of corrections in correspondence and ink under the nails. These were small facts, but joined they made a story that explained motive. If Mr. Grant had been blackmailing heirs, one could begin to see why someone might wish him to be gone. She did not leap to any conclusion about the manner of his death, Doctor. Haydock had indicated poison, and the bitter almond note was a medical detail best handled by the man who wore a doctor's jacket rather than by a curious woman at a cottage table. But one thing grew clearer. The man had not been what he claimed. He had come as a planter and settled like a gentleman. He had carried a dispatch box and a talent for turning ink into leverage. He had been a stranger who, in truth, was not a stranger to the village's old veins at all. He had learned how to press them. Miss Marple folded the letters with a care that seemed almost tender. The notion that someone had been using forged papers to make claims upon inheritance was a thread that might explain many things. The Colonel's memory of rumours, Mrs. Price Ridley's quiet indignation, the altered parish register itself. She thought of the landlady at the Blue Boar, of the dispatch box left closed at a man's feet, and of the small practical motions by which a cup is taken from kitchen to room by one who keeps the keys. There were questions enough for Inspector Slack and Dr. Haydock, and for the village to mull over. Nevertheless, she smiled to herself, faintly and without triumph. A man who will make his living by whispering of other people's faults rarely thinks to be careful of his own. Ink leaves traces as surely as a clumsy conscience leaves marks upon the lives it touches. Miss Marple rose, refilled her teapot, and took the letters with her in a neat bundle, to be given in due course to those who did the official work of examining facts. For her own part, she felt something she had not felt for a while. The satisfying certainty that, small by small, the shape of the truth was coming into view. Chapter 10. Drawing Room Truths. Gossington Hall shone that afternoon as if it had been dressed for a small festival. Dolly had insisted upon an extra fire despite the mild weather, and the drawing room glowed with a buttery warmth. A low bowl of roses rescued that morning from Miss Marple's window boxes, with her neighbourly permission gave off a faint honeyed scent. The half-sliced fruitcake sat upon its plate, as though it had never been disturbed. A silver tray with a steaming pot of tea and a row of mismatched cups had been laid out in deliberate civility. It was precisely the sort of setting in which a village likes to settle its differences. Over tea, with cake, and with an appearance of ordinary calm, Dolly moved among her guests with the hospitable bustle that had always made her drawing room the best place in the parish to be both comfortable and consoled. Colonel Bantry, pipe unlit for the moment, had chosen a chair by the window, and he looked with a mixture of curiosity and impatience at the assembled company. Reverend Leonard, Clement and Griselda sat together, their faces composed in the way of those used to receiving confessions and consolations. Dr. Haydock was present, quiet and competent. Inspector Slack, brisk and not quite at ease with the weight of a murder in so small a place, folded his hands upon his knees. Miss Hartnell and Mrs. Price Ridley occupied the settee, prim and intent. And, in a chair not far from the hearth, sat Mrs. Piper, the landlady of the Blue Boar, a woman of ordinary face and hands that had polished many a brass kettle. She kept her gaze low, her fingers busy upon her lap. Miss Marple had arranged this little meeting with Dolly's ready help. There was no theatre in her manner as she rose and asked for a cup of tea. She poured it with that small, exact ceremony that made even a moment of anxiety take the gentlest of shapes. Then she looked up and, with a smile as soft as an apple blossom, said, "I thought it best for us all to talk together, and so Dolly was kind enough to invite everyone. There are several small things that, I think, will be of use if we set them in order." Inspector Slack, whose world had been one of brisk conclusions, inclined his head. "If you mean to travel by slow talk, Miss Marple, we shall be here some time," he said, half in jest, half in business. Dolly, who liked both talk and conclusion in reasonable measure, chuckled and offered another slice of cake to anyone who would take it. Miss Marple began simply. "You have all been so kind to bring me what you have found," she observed. "I have had the dispatch box for a small while, and Dr. Haydock has been patient enough to tell me the results of the examination. There are a few threads, and I will try to be very plain." She folded her hands and looked, with a gentle insistence, at Mrs. Piper. There was a little intake of breath. Mrs. Piper's fingers tightened upon her lap. Miss Marple went on. "First, the letters in the dispatch box were written by two hands. One is neat and practised. The other is more hurried. Some of the letters speak not merely of recollection, but of corrections to parish entries language, which suggests that someone was offering to make the records reflect a particular fact, for a modest fee." She paused long enough for the meaning to settle. Such an offer is useful only if one has either access to the records or the skill to imitate them. Dr. Haydock leaned forward. "And we found," he said, "signs of poisoning. The chemical tests confirm what my examination indicated. There was a rapidly acting alkaloid present. The bitter almond smell at the scene was no mere fancy." Inspector Slack made a clipped sound. "So we have a man, present here as Mr. Grant, who kept papers suggesting he could arrange documents, and who died from poison. That much I accept," he said, "but it does not at once point to a murderer." Miss Marple's small face grew a fraction more intent. "No, Inspector, it does not. But the next things, these are the ones which make a kind of path. When I handled the letters, I noticed an odd smudge of ink upon the edge of one page, and, if you will forgive me the impertinence, the dead gentleman's nails bore small traces of ink when I saw him at the Blue Boar." She looked toward Mrs. Price Ridley, who, despite herself, made a discreet little movement as if remembering. "Ink and paper are the tools of certain trades. A planter writes of leaves, a forger writes of names." At this, Mrs. Price Ridley made a soft, discomposed sound. "But he spoke of plantations and of overseers," she said. "He had stories very plausible." Her voice had a thread of realizing worry. Miss Marple continued, quietly. "I went to the parish registers because Mr. Grant seemed very interested in entries there. I found that one small note, an entry regarding the Hartwell Lane, had been amended, and rather clumsily. It was not the lazy hand of a clerk who has grown old. It was the deliberate insertion of another hand." She tapped the place in the register she had copied earlier and let the thought hang. Colonel Bantry, who had been listening with the impatience of a man who wished pieces to fit together, muttered. So he was changing things to suit himself. Blackmail, perhaps. But who would go to murder for that? There are many angry people in Street Mary Mead. Miss Marple's eyes moved, softly, to Mrs. Piper. I have had, from different sources, she said, the story of a family that was hurt long ago post-war matters on a tea estate. I've seen a letter here, very private, which speaks of a man whose methods devastated an account and a man's prospects. Mrs. Piper's brother, a humble fellow who left for the colonies and returned less fortunate, wrote in despair. In that letter, the man is named in terms which match the descriptions we have had of Mr. Grant. She folded the paper and passed it gently to the vicar, as witness rather than accusation. Mrs. Piper's face had gone a little whiter. Her hands, which were accustomed to steady work, trembled. Colonel Bantry's mouth formed the beginnings of a surprised exclamation. "Do you mean to say—" he began. Miss Marple let her sentence answer itself by the quietness of her next words. "I mean that Mr. Grant, as he called himself, was not the man he said he was. He had come as a planter with charming tales. In truth, he used a practised pen to imply he could tidy up parish records for a small consideration. He offered corrections which might be made genuine by forgery. He collected the hopes and fears of folk who value an inheritance more than they value a fuss, and in doing so he made enemies and victims." She looked at Mrs. Piper again with an expression that sought not to blame but to understand. One of those victims was Mrs. Piper's brother. Mrs. Piper could no longer keep back the small sound that had been gathering in her throat. "It is true," she said, in a voice so low as to be almost beneath hearing. "My brother Tommy went out to the plantations to try his luck after the war. He wrote home no end of times, and then I had a letter saying he had been ruined. He lost what he had put into ledgers and contracts. When he came back, he had nothing. This man was named in the papers, and Tommy could not stand the shame. Dolly, who had remained the very picture of hospitable composure until that moment, put her hand to her mouth and gasped. 'Good heavens,' she said. 'I had no idea. Dear soul, Mrs. Piper, why did you not say something before?' Mrs. Piper looked at Dolly with eyes that had been set hard by years of keeping a place respectable. 'What could I say, Miss Bantry? A landlady does not go telling tales of a gentleman because the world is a small one. I kept it for my own grief and my brother's pride. He would not live to tell it, he was ashamed. Then the man came here. He sat in my little inn, and he made himself comfortable. He laughed at tales and took my kindness as a thing to be paid with lodging and pleasant words. I thought, perhaps I could get him to stop when I spoke, but he only smiled and said that the records were his business. Then I saw the letters. Her voice failed and she dried her eyes with the back of her hand. Inspector Slack's face had become a map of professional concern. "And you what then?" "Mrs. Piper, are you telling us you took matters into your own hands?" Miss Marple's expression was of the softest gravity. "The sequence, as I have pieced it together, is this. Mr. Grant, who made his living, it would seem, by insinuating that he could tidy parish records for a consideration, did not hesitate to press his advantage. He wrote, he hinted, he produced small corrections. When he met resistance, he used the hint of exposure. Mrs. Piper, whose family had been ruined by the same man in another time, saw her old wound opened. She confronted him. He did not deny his methods. He sneered, perhaps, and the old shame flared. There was a moment of anger and a decision taken, a terrible human choice. Mrs. Piper's face crumpled then with a weariness more than with outrage. "I did what I could," she said. "I gave him his tea as I always did. He asked for it strong that morning. I am a careful housekeeper and I made it so. He was kind to the children, he meant nothing. Perhaps, but he had taken the life out of my brother and he came back as if all were forgiven. I could not endure it." That farewell was not declamatory. It was confession in a tone that sought to be honest rather than sensational. Dr. Haydock bowed his head, not in sanction, but in the sombre understanding of a man whose profession sees the brokenness of human nature in many forms. Inspector Slack, though he was obliged to be official, had the decency to do it without theatrical cruelty. "Mrs. Piper," he said, "you will have to come with me, as is my duty. We shall need a formal statement." His voice was not unkind, but the law is a law, and the village must learn to live with that truth. Mrs. Piper rose as if she had long expected the summons. "I will go," she said simply. "I cannot undo it. I am sorry. I did not plan to kill. I only meant to stop him. The cup was there, he drank, and then he was gone. That is all." Colonel Bantry, who had uttered nothing but short, startled phrases, now capped his astonishment with a single military exclamation. "By Jove!" Dolly gave an audible little sob, half from shock and half from grief at the measure of life and cruelty. Miss Hartnell put both hands to her lips, and Griselda hid her face for a moment so that her knitting might be out of sight. Miss Marple folded her hands as if in prayer, and then spoke in that even voice which most often settled things. "We have been too ready, in all our small talk, to suspect the dramatic and the obvious. Some of our suspects, the learned doctor, the proud lady, had motive in a general sense, but not the pressing, private wound that makes a person act in an instant. It is the ordinary everyday face that most often carries a sorrow so sharp one will not mention it to others. Wickedness, or desperate remedy, wears an ordinary face. That is why we must look not only at what seems loud, but what is hushed." Inspector Slack cleared his throat, and, in the efficient manner of those who would proceed through forms, began to make his notes. Dr. Haydock consented to accompany Mrs. Piper to the station to give proper attendance, but his eyes, as he rose, had the shadow of pity in them. Miss Marple, thanking Dolly for her tea with a small attempt at cheer, collected the letters and the parish notes into the neat bundle she had placed upon her lap. Outside Gossington Hall, the world was as ordinary as ever. A postman passed with his bag, a dray rumbled along the lane, the greengrocer's boy sang as he stacked crates. But inside, the small conspiracies of ink and paper had been named, the motives laid plain, and a human tragedy had been brought into the light. The village would take its own time to breathe out and to lay the memory to rest. As the last of the company took their leave, Miss Marple rose and stood in the doorway for a moment. The roses by the window seemed, with a small courage, to hold their heads up in the mild air. She thought then of the many small human stitches that hold a village together, the lending of sugar, the keeping of registers, the duty of a landlady to see her guest cared for. Those stitches are strength, and sometimes, when a human heart is torn, they reveal how fragile a life can be, she said, softly to Dolly, as they watched Inspector Slack lead Mrs. Piper away with a professional kindness. "We must be gentle, Dolly. She has done wrong, and she will answer as the law requires, but we have found a sadness which will not be mended by harshness alone. It is well that justice is done, but let charity hold the edges." Dolly, whose heart was open and whose hands were full of hospitality, nodded. "Oh, Jane, you always have the kindest way with things," she murmured. Colonel Bantry, smoking again as he paced in the garden, muttered, "By Jove," once more, and then seemed almost immediately to return to the habit of trimming hedges, as if that could steady his mind. Miss Marple, walking home through the high street where the greengrocer nodded at her, and Mrs. Hartnell waved, felt, as she so often did, the quiet authority of small certainties. People come to a country parish with histories in their pockets, some charming, some shameful, and the work of a village is to hold them all until truth is needed. That day the truth had been needed. And in the drawing-room, with tea and cake as witnesses, truth had at last been spoken. Life in Street Mary Mead, after all its recent disturbances, soon slipped back into the gentle rhythms beloved by its inhabitants. The roses at Miss Marple's window bloomed with renewed colour, while Colonel Bantry was once again seen contentedly smoking his pipe in the garden, Dolly hovering nearby with a slice of fruit-cake she insisted must be finished. At the Blue Boar the brass kettle shone as brightly as ever, its steady ticking clock restoring the sense of homely reassurance. On Sunday mornings the bells of the parish church rang clearly across the hedgerows, and villagers lingered afterward to exchange snippets of gossip beneath lace-curtained windows. Yet, as Miss Marple would gently remind anyone who asked, human nature is much the same in village or city, and beneath the polished surface of daily life, mysteries may always be waiting. For now, however, peace reigned, with tea poured and hearths alight. Thank you, dear friends, for keeping company with us through this tale of tea and treachery at the village inn. In the quiet lanes of street, Mary Mead, we are reminded that truth often hides in plain sight, revealed only by a patient eye and an understanding heart. If such gentle mysteries delight you, I invite you to join us again. Subscribe, so each new story may find you as evening falls. Until then, may your hearth burn bright, your gardens bloom kindly, and your nights be ever peaceful.